Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, I think it's high time that I gave you guys an update on Kaspa, and I know that a lot of you have been dying for this video. So today we are going to be getting into all things Kaspa, having a quick look at Kaspa's most recent price action, having a look at the sell-off and the pretty major reversal that we have just had. But the main meat of today's video, I really want to be getting into Kaspa's power law. And the reason for that is because recently there has been a huge amount of FUD around the Kaspa power law, which I think primarily has come from this post by Giovanni going, Kaspa is saying, please can I be again a power law? I can do it, give a chance. Not sure, little Cas, that is a serious breaking of scale and variance, you know, with the chart showing what really is a significant deviation from the Kaspa power law. So today, really, I want to get into the facts and the evidence. And so we're going to be looking at the evidence that the Kaspa power law has broken, the evidence that the Kaspa power law is still in play, and also some possible explanations for the recent price action and some possible paths forward. But before we do get into it today, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also to turn on post notifications so that you don't miss any of my future videos. So of course, looking at Kaspa's price action and its most recent behavior. So first of all, we'll kind of look at it from a traditional technical analysis viewpoint. So this initial sell-off in Kaspa has caused a huge amount of fear and a huge amount of panic. But really looking at this move from a traditional technical analysis perspective, it wasn't a particularly out of the ordinary or unusual move. So in total, it was a 50% drawdown from the high, which is not too atypical for Kaspa, which has, you know, experienced multiple 40% plus drawdowns, with the largest drawdowns being closer to around 70%. So, you know, a 50% drawdown in terms of price action is nothing too out of the ordinary for Kaspa. And also in terms of timing, this move was not too far out of the ordinary. So in total, it lasted for around 96 days, the entire sell-off. And while that is the longest sell-off in Kaspa's history, with the previous longest sell-off lasting 71 days, so, you know, it was around 25 days or roughly 1 month longer than the previous longest sell-off, you know, it wasn't by any means completely out of the ordinary. And looking at more of a sort of support and resistance point of view, Kaspa bounced really relatively closely to where you would have expected it to bounce, with the bottom respecting this previous resistance trend line, and also this, you know, historical basically 1 year range now also offering a pretty clear level of support, with really only 2 daily closes actually below that level of support. And looking on the weekly, you know, there basically were no weekly closes below that level of support. And now one of the reasons that this move has felt so long and so deep is that Kaspa was really moving down during this period, while a lot of the rest of the market was in fact moving up. So for example, against Bitcoin, this move represented a 43% decline against Bitcoin, and against something like Tau, this move represented essentially a 200% underperformance against Tau. So, you know, while Kaspa was moving down for a lot of this period, the rest of the market was essentially either flat or even moving up. So it really has felt like a particularly brutal sell-off. And, you know, during really this entire period from the end of September until basically the start of November, Kaspa was trending down while the rest of the market was trending up. But clearly that move is over, and Kaspa has put in a pretty serious and pretty distinct reversal here. So, you know, looking at this from a traditional technical analysis standpoint, you know, Kaspa had a high here, then really when you discount the wicks, we had a low and then a lower high and then a lower low, and then we did make a slight higher high against this previous high. But the fact that, you know, really there was no real strength to this high, and it was a very, very minor higher high, and really did indicate a lack of demand for Kaspa in this area, potentially should have been warning of a greater sell-off coming, with, you know, new lower lows and new lower highs also being put in. But with this reversal, Kaspa has very much broken that downtrend with a significant new higher high, a significant new lower low, and then another significant new higher high. And also the fact that we have significantly broken some key areas of prior higher support that then flipped into resistance. And, you know, the fact that it pretty convincingly and quickly broke these areas of what could have been a nasty resistance level shows that, you know, demand is very much back for Kaspa. And, you know, while certainly the road is still likely to be choppy and there's still work to be done to take out some of these resistance levels, with the next really significant one being 18 cents, being kind of this resistance level here. But, you know, having said that, clearly demand is very much back for Kaspa. And based on the strength of this move, I expect these dips to be bought up fairly quickly and, you know, for the uptrend very much to continue. So, you know, from a traditional TA point of view, Kaspa is looking very strong and very healthy here. But really the question and the topic of today is around the Kaspa power law, because, you know, while from a traditional TA point of view, Kaspa is looking very strong, the fact remains that, you know, Kaspa has now deviated relatively significantly from its power law. And certainly this period here represents the biggest deviation that we have had in Kaspa's history from its power law fair value, with this spending a significant amount of time below this purple band here, with this purple band representing the minus 50% standard deviation from the power law fair value. So, you know, this certainly does lend some evidence to the idea that the Kaspa power law has potentially broken, because, you know, really based on this move below the lower standard deviation band, that indicates that going forward we can have less confidence that this band is going to hold into the future, because it has been, you know, significantly broken once. And, you know, while there has been price action outside of this band before, this is certainly the biggest deviation in terms of both price and time from the fair value. And when looking at the Bitcoin power law, and when we have a look at the similar Bitcoin adaptive power law, then really we can see that Bitcoin has never deviated as much from its power law fair value in the past. And it definitely needs to be noted that there has been times and there has been periods where the minus 50% standard deviation band has been broken, you know, both to the downside and also in its early history to the upside. But overall, Bitcoin's power law has never broken the bands as significantly as the Kaspa power law has just done. So, you know, that certainly has to be considered when looking at the Kaspa power law. And then also looking at the cycles of Kaspa, based on previous price action, Kaspa cycles were incredibly well defined and also incredibly well adhered to. And Kaspa really did, you know, really stick to these cycles in a very distinct way. But then really the cycle that we had in July was the first bit of evidence that Kaspa was beginning to deviate away from its power law. And, you know, while the cycle top in terms of timing didn't come too far away from the sort of expected peak that the cycle would predict, you know, certainly not perfect, but it wasn't too far out at all. The cycle bottom in Kaspa came really much closer to where we would have been expecting the next cycle top to be occurring. And while it is certainly possible that I need to update this model and that this model is slightly wrong, you know, the fact that Kaspa has now deviated away from this model in terms of both price and timing does lend some evidence to the idea that the Kaspa power law has in fact broken. Now I do actually in fact have a Kaspa power law model version 2, which just is slightly updated and a, you know, slightly different experimental cycle count. And then based on this one, the bottom came roughly where we would have been expecting, and then the cycle timing does seem to be pretty spot on, with Kaspa rising when this cycle would predict it to be rising. You know, this model also somewhat has its own issues, with the cycle top here in this last cycle being a little bit further out than we would have expected it, and also this prior cycle top being pretty far away from where this model would have predicted it. So, you know, certainly none of these models are perfect by any means, and they just simply provide a bit of a framework in terms of trying to time Kaspa's cycles. But, you know, certainly it would be naive to ignore this deviation that we are having. And I think really the final piece of evidence against the Kaspa power law is the exponent. And since I first started modeling Kaspa's power law, the exponent has dropped from around 4.2 to today, which is around 3.98. And the exponent basically is the growth rate of the Kaspa power law. So the higher the exponent of the power law, the higher the expected growth rate will be. So because this exponent has dropped slightly, that basically indicates that we should expect Kaspa's power law to therefore grow more slowly into the future. And while this is not unexpected at all and has actually been very similar to the behavior of the Bitcoin power law, with the early power law having a relatively volatile value of the exponent, and then over time it basically levels out and stabilizes, looking at the fact that basically it used to be in the high fours, 4.8, 4.9, and then when I modeled this and made this graph, it was 4.1, whereas now it's currently sitting at 3.98. That shows that the exponent is slowly dropping, which really is not what we want to see. And for the exponent to start rising up again, what we would need to see would be Kaspa spending some time above the power law fair value, and the power law fair value is currently sitting at a value of 30 cents. So for the exponent to start moving up again, we would need to see Kaspa sitting above 30 cents, which I think we will. I certainly think it is possible that during this move up and during this cycle that we do break that 30-cent barrier. It remains to be seen how long we are going to spend above the power law fair value. And really, we would like to see Kaspa above the fair value for a similar amount of time to the time that we have spent now below the fair value, which really has been since February of 2024. And certainly I don't know if we're going to get that amount of time above the fair value in this cycle. And I found this graphic to be quite interesting, comparing the growth of the power law exponent and the R squared of Kaspa in the green here and Bitcoin in the red against each other. But I do think this is slightly alarmist. Kaspa's power law narrative is up in the air. Its price, exponent, and R squared are not what you want to be seeing right now. Bitcoin made it through the chaotic early years and has since achieved unequivocal market dominance, likely because there was nothing like it before. Will Kaspa do the same? Believe so at your own risk. It has the king to contend with along the way. I do think that is slightly alarmist, because the graphic clearly shows that Bitcoin initially had a very high exponent, which then came down a lot and then peaked back up a little bit and then came down again, and has really since stabilized very much so. And Kaspa's really has done something very similar, with it having a huge spike, coming down a lot, and then having another few spikes along the way. And while it is trending down slightly, clearly it is also stabilizing quite a lot here. So certainly, while we would very much like to see the exponent stop dropping here and stabilize even more so, I certainly think that Kaspa definitely has enough time to do that. And based on this graphic, I think it shows that the exponent and change in exponent is not doing anything really too out of the ordinary. And while it does clearly have a lower exponent than Bitcoin does, we've always known that. We've always known that the exponent of Kaspa is lower than the exponent of Bitcoin. And I've argued in the past that that sort of lends some credence to the theory of Bitcoin as digital gold, which potentially grows at a slightly faster rate than Kaspa does. But Kaspa is still following a power law, growing at a slightly lower rate than Bitcoin does, or at least it will be lower in the future as the power law flattens out, but Kaspa being the actual usable medium of exchange. And then this graph here showing the R squareds, I think actually shows a lot of strength for Kaspa. And now we're going to get into the evidence that the Kaspa power law is very much not broken and it is still alive and well. And so the first one and the first real bit of evidence is the R squared, and the R squared is still incredibly strong. Clearly we have slightly dropped, but basically we've dropped from 0.95 to where we are currently sitting, which is at 0.9441. So clearly there has been a decrease in the accuracy of the fit of the power law, but 0.9441 is still worlds apart from any other asset out there. For example, something like Ethereum has an R squared of around 0.85, or it might even be closer to 0.8 at this point, which is a world apart from the Bitcoin power law, which has a R squared of around 0.96. So, when you compare the Bitcoin R squared versus the Kaspa R squared, Bitcoin is at 0.96, whereas Kaspa is at 0.944. And then something like Ethereum is at around 0.8. So the accuracy of the fit of data and the R squared of Bitcoin and Kaspa are worlds apart from any other asset class out there. And, the closest other asset doesn't even come close. So when you consider that, and you consider really the current strength of the Kaspa power law R squared, and the fact that it is still worlds apart from any other asset out there, even with this significant deviation that we've had here, the R squared tells us that this is still very much a power law. And just because it is marginally lower than Bitcoin's R squared, that doesn't discredit the strength of Kaspa's power law and the strength of the fit of data that Kaspa has. And really, you can kind of think of this as a level of confidence. So, arguably, we can be around 96% confident in Bitcoin's power law, and for Kaspa's power law, we can be 94.4% confident. So, arguably, while we can be slightly less confident, it is still a very strong fit of data. And this cannot be ignored. You have to consider this and how strong of a fit this really is when you're here declaring Kaspa's power law as dead. You can't just say, oh, well, Kaspa's power law is dead because it has only followed the power law 94.4% of the time. 94.4 is still a pretty good result in any field. So again, the R squared very much lends credence to the strength of Kaspa's power law. And then I know I brought up Kaspa's cycles as a point against Kaspa's power law earlier, but I think also in a way Kaspa's cycles are almost more evidence for Kaspa's power law. And the reason I'm saying that is that even though this period here the cycles kind of have deviated really from exactly what we would have been expecting them to do, and you can kind of see that from the Kaspa top and bottom oscillator, which is basically a cycles oscillator and kind of acts like a clock. With the sine wave reaching the top of the wave, that generally predicts a peak in Kaspa's price, and then the sine wave reaching the bottom of the wave, that is generally a very good predictor of a bottom in Kaspa's price. And even back to here, this was pretty accurate. And then really arguably only since here it started to significantly deviate, with the bottom coming a little bit after we would have been expecting, and it came around 50 days later than the oscillator would have actually predicted. But the fact that Kaspa's cycles are not following, the oscillators that I have modeled doesn't really change the fact that during this entire period here, Kaspa was moving up while the rest of the market was moving down, and Kaspa was showing incredible relative strength here. And then, during this period here, in this most recent sell-off, Kaspa basically was moving down while the rest of the market was moving up, which again lends more credence to the theory that Kaspa is very much its own asset and doesn't follow the rest of the market. And while the cycle count has been sort of shifted slightly, and the bottom came later than we were expecting based on Kaspa's historical cycles, clearly there is still a cycle at play, and Kaspa is very much showing that it is still its own asset and that it still doesn't really care what the rest of the market is doing. It will do its own thing regardless. And so why does Kaspa act like that if the power law is dead? And why is Kaspa so unique in that regard, in the sense that it basically has its own unique cycles completely independent of the rest of the market? So that's certainly still something to consider before you jump in and declare the Kaspa power law completely dead. Kaspa still has a mind of its own and basically does what it wants regardless of the rest of the market, whether that's a good thing and it's trending up, or it's a bad thing and it's trending down. These two periods really, and the rest of Kaspa's price history, really show the individuality of this asset, and it makes it such an interesting asset from both a technical and a fundamental point of view. And really, price is not the only metric to track. So when you look at a graph of Kaspa's hash rate also follows a power law, and the R squared of this power law is 0.95, which again is a very strong fit of data. And arguably, hash rate is a better metric of the health of a network than the prices. So the fact that this metric, which is arguably a better measure of health, still looks like a very strong and a very healthy power law, doesn't really align with the idea that Kaspa's power law has completely broken. Looking at price, it has somewhat deviated from its power law, but the other metrics of the health of the network tell a different story. So, the hash rate increasing to a very healthy level and, continuing to follow this power law shows the strength of the network, as well as the actual usage of the network and the amount of transactions per second on the network since KRC20 has come out has been, very much elevated, and shows that Kaspa Kaspa is a network with a real world application and real world adoption coming in. And so now I think this is a good time to kind of try and analyze and break down why this price action has happened and why this, real deviation from the power law has happened. And to look at that, we're going to have another look at Bitcoin, and we're going to kind of try and have to break down what has happened since KRC20. So one of the most common sort of arguments and explanations for the floor price of the power law, so, not the fair value, but the price crashes that Bitcoin and, Kaspa experience, and the fact that the lower line and the lower standard deviation band of the power law has acted as basically the bottom every single time in the past. One of the main arguments for that is that this line kind of represents the miner's defense level. So, when price reaches this low of a standard deviation against the fair value, then that represents a level of price where miners basically are massively struggling and massively underwater. So, only the most efficient miners can survive here. But even the most efficient miners often will be making a loss against the cost of electricity here. So basically they will be mining either Bitcoin or Kaspa at a higher cost here than it takes to just buy the actual underlying asset. And so what that results in basically is these miners obviously still have to cover operating cost, but instead of mining for a profit, they're basically mining more as a long-term hold and more as a sort of speculation and an investment in the asset. And so therefore, because of that, the available supply of the asset to buy on the market gradually decreases because of the behavior of the miners. And so, while that supply is decreasing, if demand has also kind of reached a level and stabilized at a constant level, then demand is staying the same while supply is slowly contracting, and that therefore basically marks bottom, and from that you get price increases. And so, arguably the same is likely true for the Kaspa power law, where the lower standard deviation band has basically represented that price point where miner behavior changes from being, purely profit and short-term price driven to basically being more of a long-term holder, and therefore selling less on the open market, which therefore in turn decreases the supply, and therefore demand stays the same. And from this lower standard deviation band, you get a bottom and a subsequent price rise. And so, while the power law fair value is basically driven by the rate of adoption of the network, the power law lower band is driven by miner behavior, at least in part. And so really looking at the point where Kaspa began to significantly deviate from the power law was this point here. And this point here, basically around this area here, was when KRC20 came out. And KRC20 was a significant change to the basically profitability of miners. And the reason for that is because after KRC20, the average fee per transaction in Kaspa basically skyrocketed. So, you can see here it spiked all the way to 2.4 average transaction fee, whereas, prior to that it was decimals of a Kaspa. And since that point, since KRC20, it has remained at a highly elevated rate. So the amount of transaction fees that miners have been receiving and have been earning since KRC20 came out has significantly increased, and therefore likely significantly changed the equation of mining, and therefore arguably has also changed the behavior of miners and basically the miner capitulation level, because miners have become so much more profitable from this point. Then this could be a very good explanation of why Kaspa has experienced such a large deviation from this point here. And so, coupled with the fact that both the average transaction fee has been massively increased since that point, and also the fact that average transactions per second has also been increased since that point. So basically what that means is that there's been many more transactions paying a much higher fee. This has significantly changed the equation of miner profitability, and therefore arguably lowered the line of miner defense. Whereas, previous to this point here, miners have been relying basically solely on Kaspa emissions. Since this point here, transaction fees have been a much greater part of the equation for profitability of miners. And so I know a lot of people have argued that this price action has been manipulation, and basically manipulation by exchanges in order to drive prices down so they can accumulate and create liquidity for their order books. And while I certainly think there has been a lot of manipulation by exchanges, in theory exchanges shouldn't be able to break or, significantly deviate an asset from its power law. So I think the argument that the equation for miners has so significantly changed since this point is quite a compelling one to me. And so arguably, I think what this means is that since this point when miner profitability changed so drastically, that basically what could have happened is that the fair value of the power law basically shifted down by around 30 to 40% or so. And so arguably in this scenario, Kaspa would very much still be following a power law. It would basically just be following a reduced fair value, probably at the same growth rate as we could have previously expected. But all that it means is that the point of capitulation for the miners, where the miners turn from sellers into more investors and more holding the project long term, and that because that equation has changed, it has also fundamentally changed the power law. So what could happen going forward is that we are still following a power law. It's just that instead of using the original bands, that we need to sort of use a 30% deviation from these bands to the downside, because Kaspa is fundamentally the same asset as it was over here, and really the only change since this point is KRC20 and the miner profitability equation. So if Kaspa is following the power law because it is a superior asset and is a superior form of money, and really is the only asset that has been following a power law except for Bitcoin, then why would it just suddenly stop because of a change to the network such as KRC20? And I think it is also potentially possible that when 10 blocks per second comes out and, transaction fees should, in theory, go down slightly, that once again, this equation for miner profitability changes again, and potentially the line is shifted up slightly from this, maybe not directly to the original line, but potentially slightly higher than it previously was. And that the sort of miner capitulation level is a key indicator for where the bottom should come based on a power law. And, this is very much a theory. This is certainly not set in stone by any means, but it could be one explanation for why we have had such a significant deviation, and the deviation occurred directly after KRC20 came out. So, that is a possibility. And I know I get accused of redrawing lines slightly, and I definitely will be getting accused of that again after bringing this up, but, it is certainly a plausible explanation in my opinion. So, I guess there are a few paths going forward. One possibility is that Kaspa has just broken the power law, that the power law is no longer valid at all. And what that means going forward into the bull run is that likely, because Kaspa has been such a performer in the past and such a strong performer in the past, and is showing such strong momentum here, is that if the power law truly has broken, then it's possible that we act more like a normal cryptocurrency and potentially see something more akin to accelerating price action, which I've been so strongly advocating against. But if Kaspa is no longer following a power law, then potentially that is what we could see, and Kaspa will act kind of more like a normal altcoin. Another possibility is that we just basically reclaim these bands, and that this has just been a blip for some reason that perhaps we just simply can't explain, and that we continue along the previous path that we did see. But then again, another possibility is that the power law equation has been changed slightly by the change in the protocol that was KRC20, and so now we are actually following basically the same rate of adoption and the same rate of growth, but just that the equation for miner profitability has somewhat shifted the actual values of the power law. And whether 10 and 32 and 100 blocks per second maybe changes that again and means that we sort of resume along the original power law, that is also a possibility. And instead of breaking it here, we kind of come down and then resume along the original power law. Again, this is a possibility. Who knows what those changes will bring, but it is possible that something like this occurs. But overall, however Kaspa behaves, it is still fundamentally the best asset out there, and it is the best form of money that humanity has ever had. And one little blip below the power law standard deviation band that we originally had does not change that fact. So just remember, know what you hold, know why you have invested in Kaspa, and basically try and ignore some of the noise and some of the FUD. And if the price action is ever scaring you, then remember price is not the only metric of network health. You know, fees per transactions, average transactions per second, and also the hash rate are also indicators of health, and they have all been showing that the adoption of Kaspa is increasing and the network is being used as it should be used, as a medium of exchange. So, you know, let me know in the comments which of these scenarios you'd prefer to see. Would you prefer to see Kaspa acting more like a normal altcoin and having a blow off top? Would you prefer to see the original bans being reclaimed, or would you prefer to see a new power law and potentially some new bans being set where we have, you know, potentially sacrificed price slightly and, you know, the fair value has decreased slightly, but in exchange the health of the network and the usage of the network has all received a significant benefit? So let me know which of those you'd rather see. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe, but other than that, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, cheers.